Now that we have covered all the different sections of the input XML file, we will create a few examples together. In the first example, I would like to configure an XDM server on a Linux machine that will use an external Oracle database. We will also modify a few of the default directories, define a new user to run the XDM server, and set the number of the concurrent users. Prerequisites for using Oracle as an external database are to have Oracle installed and to have the tablespace and the user created with all the privileges. You can find an example of such a script in the IT Professional Guide for the System Utilities Toolbox manual. In many companies, a DBA will create the database for you. If this is the case at your company, make sure you have all of the Oracle information available for use, such as server and port, username and password, tablespace and default tablespace, and of course, the Oracle service name. As just mentioned, a prerequisite is to have the Oracle Instant Client installed on the XDM server. You should manually download the Instant Client from the Oracle website, as done here. I will now use the sample input XML file called minimum configuration sample for Linux. As you can see, there are only two sections in it, the system server and the vault configuration. I would like to change the name of my system. I will verify that the XDM server installed here is correct. Since I want to change the target directory of the active XDM server, I will open the full configuration sample input XML file. I can now very easily copy tags into my configuration XML file. In a similar way, I can now copy and paste the server load settings section and define the num of client accessing system server. I can copy the server user section and define the XDM server user. Now it's time to define the Oracle configuration. Let's copy the Oracle section and modify the values based on the information I received from my DBA. I'm using the server name and the port. I define the user and the password, the service name, the tablespace, and let's not forget the location of the instant client that I previously installed. I will save the file. I would like to share an important feature with you. It is not just for advanced users. The Oracle password as well as the server user password are stored in clear text in the input XML file. This is a risk. If you want to encrypt the password, run the config password encrypt and the argument of the XML file name. The passwords are now encrypted, and only the deployment utility can decrypt it. To import the configuration, I will run the config import utility with the argument of the XML file that I just created. I can check the pending configuration by running diag pending config. And I can specifically check the Oracle configuration before deploying the server by running diag pre-deploy test -Oracle. Let's have a look at a Windows example. In this example, I would like to define XDM server to use SSL, and I would like to define a license server. A prerequisite for using SSL is to have a certificate for the server. You should use a certificate that was created by a trusted CA, but you can use a self-signed certificate as well. In our example, my certificate is located here. Defining cipher suite and unlimited strength jurisdiction policy files are optional and are not covered in this video. I will now use the sample XML file called minimum configuration sample for Windows. I can modify the two sections that already exist in it. And I can add more sections simply by copying them from the full configuration sample XML. I'm copying the license paths tag and the SSL config tag into the system server section. I can define multiple license servers or paths to license files separated with semicolon. On the SSL enabled tag, I will verify that enabled flag is set to true. This will enable the SSL configuration. I can set the port to 31443 and disable the web port. This is the non-secured port. I will remove the advanced security option by deleting the encryption section. The certificate info tag is the location in the XML file where you can define the format of the certificate file, JKS in this example, the file itself, as well as the password and the alias. To import the configuration, I will run the config import utility using the argument of the XML file that I just created. I can check the pending configuration by running diag pending config, and I can check the configuration before deploying the server by running diag pre-deploy test. One of the checks is to verify that the certificate file exists and that the password is correct. What if you would like to add LDAP and SMTP? How can this be done after importing the configuration file? That's simple. You can either add it to the existing XML and run config import, or you can create an XML file specifically for LDAP and SMTP and import it. Let's run through creating a separate LDAP and SMTP XML file. I will copy the LDAP and SMTP sections into a blank text file that only have a utilities configuration section in it as well as the version. Now I can modify the LDAP server and port, define true if it uses SSL, and even provide a certificate for the LDAP server. In a similar way, I can modify the SMTP server and port. I believe that by now you have the understanding how to modify the input XML file. Remember, you can import as many XML files as needed. All of the information is stored in a pending configuration file, but will not be used by the XDM server until you run the server deploy utility. In this training, we customize the configuration of two XDM servers. We use the best practice to copy and paste sections from the XML samples into our modified input XML file. The first example was a Linux machine that we configured to use an external Oracle database. We modified the default directories, the user that ran the XDM server, and updated the number of concurrent users. In the second example, we configured SSL on Windows and set the license server. Later, we also demo how to update an existing configuration by adding SMTP and LDAP definitions.